Hi, and welcome to the 26th installment of the Dad Project. Tonight, as promised, we'll take a look at the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. This is an airplane that was born in the golden age of jet aircraft, the late 40s and early 50s. But, unlike many of the other designs of the period, it would be an exercise in simplification. It was designed to replace the Douglas AD Skyraider, both of which were designed by the same man, Ed Heineman of Douglas Aircraft. So, this is the story of two different aircraft designed in two distinct eras by the same man, and how dramatically the advent of the jet engine affected the development of military aircraft following World War II, but also how Heineman's design philosophy proved the success of both designs. And as usual, we will dive in a little deeper before we get to my father's very limited association with the scooter. But first, you know the drill. Let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Anyone with an interest in military aviation knows about Kelly Johnson and Lockheed's Skunk Works. The U-2, the SR-71, the F-104, the F-117, and the P-38, among others, are all cutting-edge designs that capture the imagination of pilots and the general public alike. They are testaments to what can be done by engineers wielding slide rules and hundreds of draftsmen to ink their designs. These designs were so cutting-edge that the existence of several of these aircraft were closely held secrets for years. The F-117 was so important, in fact, that when one crashed in the Sequoia National Forest in 1986, a large area was cordoned off, including the airspace above the area to prevent casual or more determined observers to view the scene. Additionally, to be sure there would be no association with a secret program, after Air Force personnel had picked up the area clean of the F-117's debris, it was replaced with the wreckage of a McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. Yeah, but who's Ed Heineman, and how does he fit in with the pantheon of aircraft designers? When Ed Heineman died in 1991, the Los Angeles Times obituary noted that he was a prolific aircraft designer whose pioneering fighter planes earned him the nickname Mr. Attack Aviation. His prolific career began after he dropped out of Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles at the age of 17 to join Douglas Aircraft as a draftsman in 1926. From there, he would work for several other aircraft companies, the last one as a project engineer for the Northrop Aircraft Corporation in 1930 before joining Douglas. It would be at Northrop that Heineman would be responsible for the Northrop XBT-1 dive bomber in 1936. It proved to be an ill-handling, underperforming aircraft. However, not to be dissuaded, Heineman would fix its weaknesses and the XBT-2 would be born. Before the XBT-2 could be successfully offered up to the Navy, Northrop would be sold to Douglas Aircraft, and with that sale came the XBT-2. Heineman came along as well to become the Vice President for Military Engineering. So, after a mere 10 years, this high school dropout had become the Chief Engineer at Douglas, a feat that is nearly incomprehensible in our day and age. More importantly for the outcome of World War II, the progenitor of the SBD Dauntless dive bomber had come with him, the XBT-2. When war broke out in the Pacific, the United States had the good fortune to have the three carriers attached to the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and Saratoga, away from Pearl Harbor. That was the good news. The bad news, well, let's call it less than good news, was that the aircraft attached to these carriers were an antiquated collection of aircraft that would serve heroically under the control of pilots doing their best with what they had before their planes could be replaced with more capable aircraft. Only 2 aircraft from this melange would serve throughout the war, the Grumman Wildcat and the Douglas SBD Dauntless. The Vindicator, the Devastator, the Buffalo, among others, were quickly relegated to the trash heap or training commands. Although the Dauntless's performance was not much better than a T-6 trainer, Heineman had created an incredibly stable bomb platform that allowed for incredible accuracy in the hands of a well-trained pilot. It was during one of the most pivotal naval battles ever fought, the Battle of Midway, that the Dauntless would make a name for itself. While 35 of the 41 Devastators attacking the Japanese fleet were being shot down, with not a single successful torpedo strike, the Japanese gunners' attention, fully absorbed, missed the SBDs dive bombing their carriers. All 4 of the Japanese fleet carriers were sunk at Midway as a result of the dive bombing capability of Heineman's design and refinement of the Northrop XBT-1. And with that success, historian Walter Lord wrote in his book Incredible Victory, they had no right to win, yet they did, and in doing so, they changed the course of a war. The Dauntless would not effectively be replaced during the war. Its intended replacement, the Curtiss SB-Ducey Helldiver, was a problematic, cursed program whose intended improvements over the Dauntless were minimal at best. However, Heineman and Douglas would find themselves designing an aircraft to meet the Navy's requirement for a carrier-based, single-seat, long-range, high-performance dive and torpedo bomber to replace not only the Dauntless, but the Grumman Avenger and the Helldiver. Now, while Kelly Johnson's designs pushed the envelope of technology, at nearly every turn, our man Ed Heineman took a more pedestrian approach to his designs, and most of his work was done in the light of day. In the January 1953 issue of Popular Mechanics, Heineman wrote an article titled Headaches of the Jet Designer, where he outlined the various complications that arose as speeds and altitudes of aircraft increased along with the complications of various automatic systems. He praises American-built aircraft as the most complete and best built in the world, but added a concern that hounds U.S. aircraft industry to this day. We are fighting wars with Cadillacs, whereas both World War II and the Korean incident have shown that our enemies employ stripped-down hot rods. He goes on to say, perhaps we are selling the pilot short, and it may be well that if we put our efforts into supplying aircraft with higher performance and less automatic or convenience features, the pilot airplane team would be more effective. With this in mind, he and his team at Douglas went about designing the Douglas AD Skyraider. Part of his move towards simplification was also weight reduction to keep the resulting design well below the Navy's requirements for an aircraft with a maximum weight of 18,500 pounds. The reduction in weight would also improve the performance of the resulting design. To get this point across, he sent out a bulletin to his designer showing that for every 100 pounds saved, the takeoff roll would be reduced by 8 feet, the combat radius would be increased by 22 miles, and the climb rate would be increased by 18 feet per minute. His team was able to reduce the weight of the plane by 1,800 pounds that enabled the AD to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance to give it, his words, the striking power of a heavy cruiser and to be considered the best version of an attack plane yet to be built. He finally summarizes his thoughts about the continuing complexities of modern aircraft this way. Complexity, therefore, is not a sign of perfection. Engineers are frequently lauded for the intricacy and complexity of their designs. This is a grave error. True perfection is a matter of solving problems by avoiding them and applying ingenuity to achieve simplification. This was and would be the bellwether he followed for one project to the next. The design of the Skyraider had begun during World War II, and it would fly for the first time in March of 1945, and too late for that war. Its predecessor, the SBD, had been designed in the 30s, and in its final version it was powered by a 1,200 horsepower engine that allowed it a weapons payload of 2,250 pounds while cruising at 185 miles per hour with a crew of 2. Heineman may have eschewed the trend of aircraft designers to complicate their designs, but he was not averse to incorporating the latest in engine technology to motivate his designs. The SBD used the venerable Wright R1820 Cyclone 9-cylinder single-row radial engine that was the outgrowth of an engine that was used in 1925 and would be produced well into the 50s. The Skyraider would mount the Wright R3350 Duplex Cyclone, a twin-row supercharged air-cooled radial aircraft engine with 18 cylinders displacing nearly 3,350 cubic inches and cranking out 2,700 horsepower. Although the Skyraider didn't increase cruise and top speed much more than the SBD, it did quadruple the weapons load to an impressive 10,500 pounds on 15 hardpoints, a larger payload than the B-17. Despite the considerable drawdown of forces and budgets following World War II, the Navy kept the Skyraider program alive by cutting its production order, and it would become the Navy and Marine Corps' primary attack and close air support platform in the post-war era and well into the early years of Vietnam, when it would overlap with its replacement, the Skyhawk. The Korean War is where the Skyraider would shine, and the production line would ramp up to complete 2 Skyraiders a day until hostilities came to an end. By the time the production ceased in 1957, over 3,000 A1s had been produced. But like any weapons program, an RFP had gone out a little over 5 years after the Skyraider's first flight for its replacement. Heineman wasn't new to designing jet aircraft when he began to work through the design process for the Skyraider's replacement, the A-4D Skyhawk. The F-3D Skyknight, the A-3 Skywarrior, 2 research aircraft, the Skystreak and the Skyrocket, that would become the first aircraft to fly at Mach 2 with Scott Crossfield at the controls, and in Installment 22, I explore my dad's time with Heineman's Delta Wing beauty, the F-4D Skyray. I'm sure all of these aircraft had Heineman calling for simple solutions for complex problems, but the Skyhawk would be the epitome of his solving problems by avoiding them and applying ingenuity to achieve simplification. As mentioned earlier, Heineman bemoaned the trend towards heavier, costlier jet-powered aircraft, and he would outline his idea for a lightweight interceptor to Admiral Apollo Susek at a meeting in January of 1952 at the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics in D.C. Susek would remind him that several interceptor programs had already been canceled, but could this approach be used for a jet-powered light attack bomber? Certainly, responded Heineman, and 12,000 pounds would be a reasonable weight for such a design, the same empty weight as a Skyraider. This was greeted with skepticism by the Admiral and his entourage, but he encouraged Heineman to draw up a working concept. In fact, Heineman's team would work towards an empty weight of a little over 8,000 pounds. From there, it would be a development period of several years before being declared operational in October of 1956, a span of 4 years that, like Heineman's rise to the head of engineering at Douglas, is incomprehensible to systems development in our modern age. For Heineman and his team, the Skyhawk would be all about the performance that could be gained with weight savings. Consideration number 1 would be to eliminate the need to fold the wings, and by limiting the wingspan to only 27 feet, job done. 200 pounds of folding mechanism eliminated. With no need to fold the wing, a single wing box could be used. The wing could then be a wet wing that could hold 560 gallons with 240 gallons of fuel in the fuselage. This configuration would reduce the need for an extensive fuel valve and pipe system and inherent weight with it. Redundant hydraulic systems for the landing gear were eliminated by having the wheel retract forward, so should the hydraulic system fail, the gear could be dropped into the slipstream and locked into place. Additionally, the control column could be extended 12 inches to give the pilot better leverage to overcome a hydraulic failure. These are just a few of the numerous weight savings ideas that made their way into the Skyhawk. And just to drive the point home, Heineman had a sign over his door that read, "If it's less weight, more gas, simple design, better quality, improved takeoff, less gingerbread, better performance, come in. As a matter of fact, we're glad to have you." When the prototype XA-4D was introduced in June of 1954, it weighed in at 7,898 pounds, almost 300 pounds below Douglas's own empty weight target. Like the Skyraider, it was able to carry more tonnage than the B-17, but it was able to do it at over twice the speed as the Skyraider with a minimal loss of range. But because of refueling capability, this wasn't an issue. Like many successful aircraft systems, it's easy to overlook early concerns with the initial design. Heineman and his team had done everything possible to reduce the weight of the Skyhawk, but during the test flying and fleet introduction program at Pax River, the shakeout noted many deficiencies. So many unfavorable comments were written during the testing process about the A-4D1 that the Navy briefly looked into modifying the FJ-4 Fury as a possible replacement for the A-4. The Fury, the Navy version of the F-86, was designed as a fighter, and despite North America's best efforts to outfit it with sufficient speed brakes, spoilers, and an improved control system, the Fury would never be up to the task. To be sure of that, Heineman, who had gotten wind of the Navy's wandering eye, immediately and quickly addressed all the deficiencies noted by the test crews, and the improved airframe would be fleet accepted by the Navy. The production run would last until 1979, after 2,960 airframes had been built. Whether we like it or not, success of a weapon system is based on how well it performs in combat. Many beautiful aircraft have been produced to carry out roles they would never have a chance to fulfill. Think of the massive, complicated star of the film Strategic Air Command, the B-36 Peacemaker. This bomber, capable of delivering nuclear weapons, only managed to perform this task once by accident, while on a simulated bombing run over Alaska. Because of severe icing, the aircraft lost 3 of its 6 engines, with the other 3 unable to deliver full power and losing altitude quickly. Before the crew abandoned the aircraft, the Mark IV atomic bomb was jettisoned and detonated mid-air. Being a practice mission, the plutonium core had not been loaded, so the 5,000 pounds of conventional explosives necessary to begin the nuclear reaction, had the plutonium core been present, only blew the bomb to pieces. For many other aircraft that were dutifully flying interminable practice missions, Vietnam would prove the crucible to test their mettle. Nearly 100 different types of fixed and rotary-winged aircraft would be flown during the Vietnam War. Of that number, the U.S. flew 85 different types and would lose 8,540 of those aircraft. Of this number, only a few would truly define the air war in Vietnam, and my apologies to the rotary wing community, but I'm only going to mention fixed-wing aircraft. The F-4 Phantom, the B-52 Superfortress, the F-105 Thunderchief, the MiG-21, and tonight's subject, the A-4 Skyhawk, are particular standouts. Operation Rolling Thunder was a complicated, mismanaged bombing campaign. For the Navy's part, aircraft would be launched from carriers steaming in the Gulf of Tonkin to carry out their part of the operation. F-4s, A-1s, and A-4s could all deliver bombs, but it was the A-4 that bore the brunt of this duty during the operation. Alpha strikes, intricately planned and timed, would try to take out the target of the day. Sometimes the target would be bombed consecutively, but more often than not, the target would be left alone to rebuild, while targets selected by planners in D.C. would assume their attention, for reasons unknown to the airmen. No one would call this a war-winning strategy, and it wasn't. It was a political game of escalation and de-escalation. Ultimately, this really didn't matter, because whatever the target was, it was usually heavily defended. Small arms fire, SAMs, AAA, all coming up en masse. Before being pulled from Navy service in Vietnam in 1970 to be replaced by the A-7, the Navy and Marine Corps would lose 362 A-4s of all types. Commander Everett Alvarez, the first and longest-serving American POW, would be shot down in his A-4 in 1964, while John McCain would be shot down in his A-4 in 1967. Despite the losses, the A-4 proved to be a robust and reliable airframe that even with considerable battle damage could bring its pilot home. And in the end, that's all you can really ask of your mount. Selling a weapon system to allies can be a difficult task, but one a manufacturer typically takes on. When it is possible, the aircraft is typically a dumbed-down version of the one supplied to U.S. forces. The A-4 couldn't have been simpler, even in its American livery, and would be supplied to 9 foreign air forces. Surprisingly, very few were purpose-built, the majority of the airframes coming from existing U.S. stock and modified for the user. 2 air forces in particular would use their Skyhawks to great effect. The Israelis would operate 200 A-4s, and they were the backbone of their ground attack forces, having replaced several French airframes. During the Yom Kippur War, 30 A-4s would be lost in one day to SAMs, the same fate as 32 American A-4s in Vietnam. In the hands of the Argentinians, a fleet of 130 dilapidated A-4s, most of the airframes unusable because of the U.S. arms embargo placed in 1976 because of the Dirty War, would do considerable damage to the Royal Navy during the Falklands War. More famously, the HMS Sheffield would be sunk by French Exocet missiles during the conflict, but the A-4s, flying at the extreme edge of their range, would sink the HMS Coventry, Ardent, Antelope, RFA Sir Galahad, and the LSU F-4. The flight crews of the Argentinian A-4s are still celebrated as heroes. But for the general public, the A-4 was an ambassador and a movie star, not a fighter. The A-4 would be, for 13 years, the poster child for naval aviation as the performance aircraft for the Blue Angels, and, until its replacement by the F-18, the Blue Angels' longest-serving aircraft. Its other starring role was as an aggressor aircraft in the Top Gun program. It was the gnat that bugged the Glory Hog F-14 pilots in the movie Top Gun that would see Maverick fly below the hard deck in search of a kill and to bellow, "Juster's dead." Initially, the A-4, F-5, and T-38s were well suited to mimic the smaller Soviet fighters, but as the Soviet and eventual Russian aircraft became more sophisticated and larger, the A-4, F-5, and T-38 were retired in favor of other platforms. My dad would have a one-off oddball joyride at Top Gun in a T-38 for a 1V2 with Alex Rucker, and I'm still trying to find out more about that flight, but he is far more familiar with the A-4. Like a number of the aircraft my dad would have time in, his initial introduction to the A-4 would be in service tests at Pax River. When he took his first familiarization flights on March 18th of 1963, the A-4 was well established in the fleet and still a year away from a major role in Operation Rolling Thunder, and well before it took his turn as an aggressor aircraft for Top Gun. His flight in the A-4 would be several test and evaluation programs for the A-4, B, C, and E. We'll start with the A-4B. Aside from its duties as an attack aircraft, the A-4 had been developed as a buddy tanker. This was a duty that Heineman had initially tried to dissuade the Navy of, saying it would be a ruin of a good aircraft, and there simply wasn't enough room for the pumps, hoses, etc. Being told otherwise, Douglas would then develop the ingenious self-powered 300-gallon streamline tank that could be loaded on any or all three of the aircraft's hardpoints. And in September of '64, a new probe-seeking refueling drogue needed evaluation for the A-4B, and somebody needed to fly the A-4B as the tanker pilot, and that would be my dad. Straight and level, engage, disengage, repeat. For the A-4C, it would be an evaluation of the New York Hydraulic Pump Company's Flight and Utility Hydraulic System. Not exciting, but more important in an aircraft that had done away with a redundant hydraulic system to save weight. And then, on to the really exciting stuff, testing the engine vibration analyzer. On the face of it, it doesn't sound especially interesting, but he would spend 5 months working through this particular problem. And, as outlined in a paper published by the Military Technical College in Cairo, Egypt, Vibration Signature Analysis of Turbojet Engines, as turbojet engines exhibit vibrations whose amplitudes change with the lifetime and the operating conditions of the engine, the analysis of vibration signals in the frequency domain provides quantitative information about the dynamic behavior of the engine and a qualitative measure of its performance. I'm not sure where the fun began and where the fun ended for that one. Finally, the A4E and some accelerated engine tests on the newly installed Pratt & Whitney J52 P6 engine. I suspect this could be interesting as the engine would have to be tested in different flight attitudes, altitudes, and power settings, and additionally to be sure any anomalies that were present before the new engine was installed were either solved or still there. Or maybe I'm trying to make it much more exciting than it was. And that would be it for the A4. But it wasn't. During my dad's 2 weeks of active duty in the reserves in 1971 while flying RF-8s, he would spend 3 days of that time at Miramar with VF-126, where he would bone up on his instrument skills and the TA-4. Now, the ins and outs of squadron designations, when they were established, when they were disbanded, then reestablished, even renamed, can be a mind-bending exercise. So, when I first looked up VF-126, I fixated on the fact that it was an aggressor squadron for Top Gun. Eventually, yes, but in 1971 it was still, mainly, there to support VF-121 in its part as the replacement air group for the Pacific F-4 squadrons. The not quite official standing of Top Gun at the time would blur the lines considerably until Top Gun was officially recognized. Long story short, as I said, he was there for further instrument training. The kink in the story, however, was that while he was at service test, he was a technical advisor for the cockpit layout and associated basic human factors engineering for the TA-4. So he had a chance to experience some of his earlier work. And then, on May 21st, 1971, after taxiing his TA-4 to the VF-126 Fighting Seahawks hangar at Miramar, his 70.4 hours in the Skyhawk had come to an end. His time in the A-4 and his thoughts on flying the Skyhawk, like just about every other plane he flew, is a mystery, at least to me. His terse, very abbreviated answers to the few questions I was able to ask left very little room for interpretation, but this approach is excellent for a report that needs to be concise and brief to relate a problem or concern with an aircraft to engineers and design teams, just not your family. In any case, next time, we'll have a look at another Grumman product, the F-9F Cougar and Panther. So, until next time, thanks for joining me for the 26th installment of the Dad Project. And for the 26th time, as many of you already know, I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the journey. So, please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.